Today we're talking about one of the most important skills in Magic: how to correctly take your turn without turning the game into a rules escape room. If you're new to Magic, the turn structure can look like a giant pile of phases, steps, and weird words people say with way too much confidence. But the good news is this: once you understand the flow, a turn is actually very manageable. And even better, most of the time, nothing wild happens in a lot of these phases unless a card specifically says it does. In this video, I'll walk you through the order of a turn, explain common mistakes beginners make, and translate some of the game's most confusing vocabulary into normal human language. So whether you've just opened your first starter deck, or you've been quietly nodding along at Friday Night Magic while hoping nobody asks you what happens in upkeep, this one's for you. Before we jump in, let's define a few Magic words. The active player is the player whose turn it is. Priority basically means permission to do something, like cast a spell or activate an ability. The stack is the game's waiting room, where spells and abilities go before they resolve. A triggered ability is an ability that happens when something specific occurs, usually started with the words when, whenever, or at. Sorcery speed means something you usually do in your main phase when nothing else is waiting to happen. Instant speed means something you can do whenever you have priority, even on your opponent's turn. Your turn starts with the beginning phase, which is 3 steps: untap, upkeep, and draw. Untap is exactly what it sounds like. You untap your tap cards. This part usually happens automatically, and players normally don't cast spells here. Then comes upkeep. This is where cards that say things like, at the beginning of your upkeep, care about the game. If a card wants you to pay a cost, lose life, gain life, make a token, or do some weird upkeep nonsense, this is where it usually happens. Then comes draw, where you draw your card for the turn. A very common beginner mistake is treating upkeep like it doesn't exist. People untap, draw, and zoom straight into the rest of the turn. But upkeep matters because many triggered abilities happen there. Another common mistake is thinking you can respond during untap the same way you can in other parts of the turn. Usually you can't. Untap is mostly just a game resetting your stuff. So the easiest beginner shortcut is untap your cards, briefly check if anything says at the beginning of your upkeep, then draw your card. Next is the Precombat main phase. This is a phase most players think of as a do stuff phase. This is where you usually play a land for the turn, cast creatures, cast sorceries, and generally set up your board before combat. A useful beginner rule is this: if the card is not an instant and it doesn't have a special keyword like flash that lets you cast it later, you'll usually be casting it in one of your main phases. A classic mistake here is forgetting that you get only one land play each turn. Another is assuming you must do everything before combat. You don't. There are 2 main phases in a turn, one before combat and one after combat. So, if you're unsure whether to cast a creature before attacking, remember, sometimes waiting until after combat is perfectly fine. The game gives you another chance. Combat is where the turn gets the most attention, but it also becomes much less scary when you break it into pieces. There's a beginning of combat step, a declare attacker step, a declare blocker step, a combat damage step, and an end to combat step. That may sound like a lot, but for most beginner games, you can think of it as announce you're moving to combat, choose attackers, let your opponent choose blockers, then deal damage. Here's the important part. The reason all these steps exist is to create windows where cards and abilities can matter. For example, some cards trigger at the beginning of combat. Some spells are strongest after attackers are declared, but before damage happens. But if nobody has a card that cares about those moments, combat often feels simple and fast. That's why turn structure can look more intimidating on paper than it does in a normal beginner game. One very common mistake is rushing through combat without clearly communicating. A good habit is to say, move to combat before you attack. Another common mistake is skipping straight to damage without giving your opponent a chance to block or cast something. And a very beginner-friendly reminder: attacking does not automatically mean your creatures survive, and blocking does not automatically mean the blocker survives either. Creatures deal damage based on their power, and if they take damage equal to or greater than their toughness in the same turn, they're usually destroyed. Next is the post-combat main phase. This phase is basically your second chance to do main phase stuff. You can cast creatures, artifacts, enchantments, sorceries, and play effects that work at sorcery speed if you still have the resources. For beginners, this phase is great because it removes the pressure to do everything before combat. You can attack first, see what happens, and then decide what to cast afterward. A common mistake is forgetting this phase even exists. New players will attack, deal damage, and then say, "Okay, your turn," while still holding cards they could have played. So remember, after combat, you still get another main phase before your turn ends. The ending phase has two parts: the end step and cleanup. The end step is where cards that say, at the beginning of your end step, happen. This is another place beginners accidentally skip. Then comes cleanup, where damage wears off creatures, and if you have too many cards in hand, you discard down to your maximum hand size, which is usually 7. The big mistake here is ending your turn too casually. If you have cards or permanents that care about your end step, this is their moment. Also, some players forget that combat damage doesn't stay on creatures forever. That damage clears off in cleanup. So if a creature survives a turn, it usually gets to start fresh next turn unless another effect says otherwise. Here's the secret that makes all of this easier. The phases and steps mostly exist, so the game knows exactly when card abilities are allowed to matter. They are like labeled checkpoints. If nobody has a spell or ability that cares about a specific checkpoint, the game just moves along. That means you do not need to panic and perform a courtroom-level rule speech every single turn. Most turns are untap, upkeep check, draw, main phase, combat, second main phase, end step. Nice and clean. The biggest mistakes are usually these: skipping upkeep, forgetting post-combat main phase, rushing through combat without clear communication, forgetting that end step abilities exist, and misunderstanding when you are actually allowed to cast certain cards. If you remember nothing else, remember this: slow down, say your phases out loud, and check whether any card you control cares about that moment. So that's how a turn works in Magic. The Gathering. Yes, there are a lot of labels. Yes, some of the vocabulary sounds like it was invented by a wizard tax attorney. But once you know the order and understand that most steps are only dramatic, when a card makes them dramatic, the whole game becomes much easier to follow. If this helped, drop a comment with the phase that confused you the most when you started playing. And if you want, I can also make a follow-up script about priority, the stack, and how In Response actually works without making everyone at the table cry.